Howdy, and welcome to Aggie Horticulture Facebook Live. This program has been brought to you by the team of Texas A&M AgriLife Extension horticulturists and the Aggie Horticulture programs. Aggie Horticulture is here to provide quality information that will help you improve your gardening skills, home fruit production, vegetable production, ornamental production. We're here to provide to you science-based information that will help you improve the skills that you currently have. I'm Stephen Brueggerhoff, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service Extension Agent in Horticulture for Brazoria County. Figs are an important part of our culture, I think. They've been part of the human culture for millennia. And we'll talk a little bit about figs, how they grow, a little bit of information you may not have known about their fruiting structure, and of course the rock stars, some of the varieties that we can include in our home landscaping. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Texas A&M AgriLife Extension offers research-based education that helps consumers understand how their food choices impact their health. And we do that through a broader initiative called Path to the Plate. Path to the Plate encompasses all the best of what we offer to our communities. Everything from family and community health to ag and natural resources. Yes, even horticulture is a part of that family, helping to provide proper information to you, research-based information that will help improve your home life. Our agenda today, fabulous figs. We'll talk a little bit about fig culture, where figs come from, some things you may know, some things you may not have known. Of course, we need to talk about site characteristics, the importance of soil and water tests as well. I offer to you 6 steps to orchard culture. So even though the information that I'm provided may be more applicable towards orchard establishment, the information that I'm providing to you today will apply to your single planting. You're putting out maybe one fig tree in your backyard. This information will be very valuable and will apply to your cultivation of that tree in your backyard. Of course, we have to talk about the rock stars. We'll talk about fabulous figs, the varieties that are appropriate depending on where you are in Texas, and of course some resources. So let's get growing. Fig culture. Fig, the botanical name is Ficus carica. This is a member of the Moraceae family or the mulberry family. It's a family that includes both trees that we consider to be more ornamental. The fig tree, Ficus carica, is the edible member of that family. They're native to Western Asia. They've been around for millennia, used by many, many different cultures. They were thought to have been brought to California from Spain in the 1700s. As the Spaniards were developing land in that area and developing the missions that they had along the coast of California. Commercial production in the early 1900s was a large part of our economy here in the Upper Gulf Coast Bend. Commercial production was really high here in Brazoria and Galveston County in the early 1900s. The variety that was used at that time was a larger fruiting variety called Magnolia. Some of you may already have a Magnolia variety of fig in your yard. You know how big those fruits can get. They're fairly large, about 3 inches to 4 inches in diameter, really robust fruit. They were used for canning as well as dried confection. Speaking of dried confection, my office is in the county seat of Brazoria County. It's in Angleton. Angleton is right in between Houston and a Gulf coastal town called Freeport or Lake Jackson. So we're right in between there. But there used to be a large canning facility here in Angleton called the Angleton Fig Company, and they were known throughout Texas for creating a confection known as the Fignolia, which was a chocolate-covered magnolia fig. Really interesting. Of course, now in our contemporary culture, over time, those canneries went into decline and fig culture went out of fashion or went out of production due to many, many different reasons. One of them, of course, was one of the hurricanes that we experienced in 1932, as well as the Great Depression of the 30s and the 40s. Of course, that affected production, and fig production went into decline over time. Now, in the United States, 98% of fig production on this continent is produced out of California. There's quite a number of production down in southern part of California regarding figs, and those are exported nationally as well as somewhat overseas. I love this image from San Leon, Texas. San Leon is a small little community closer to Galveston on the coast. This is an image that I borrowed from one of the newspapers in an article taking figs to market in San Leon. This image was taken in 1922, and I'll bet you those were probably magnolia figs in the back of that truck. Now we know that figs can get pretty big. They are a spreading multi-trunk specimen. They naturally want to occupy a lot of space. They can get to be up to 20 to 25 feet tall if you let them, and of course they can get just as wide. If you're going to plant a fig tree, remember you've got to get a bit adequate room, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, a little bit more in detail. They do have shallow fibrous root systems. That will make more sense as we talk about maintenance for these trees. What that means is they are drought and frost sensitive. With a fibrous root system, shallow root system, it means that they are much more susceptible to water loss, as well as those climatic conditions, the seasonal frosts that we might get even here in Brazoria County. Remember, this will make more sense as we go along in this presentation. Figs must be ripened on the tree and are perishable. If you take a green fig prior to its maturity or ripeness on a tree and expect it to ripen on a countertop, it will not. You have to let these fruits get pretty ripe, pretty mature on the tree before you remove them and then use them as a fresh fruit. These trees also like it in the soil range pH range between 6 and 7.5. And this will make sense in just a moment when I start talking about location. I love this image. I pulled it from a publication from the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. It's of a mission fig tree. This image was taken circa early 1900, maybe late 1800s. You can kind of get an idea of how big these trees can get with the image of that man in the foreground. Now, I like to offer to you to get to know where you live, get to know what your environment is. This is really important. Where you're located on the map dictates what kind of plants you can work with successfully in your environment. Here in Brazoria County, I love this image of Brazoria County. Here we have these wonderful open prairie, a lot of clay in our soil, so we get saturated soil, sometimes a little swampy in areas, honestly, but we have these wonderful old oak trees, very, very graceful and elegant. Of course, you might have some property that looks like this wherever you're located, or potentially you may have something a little bit clearer. You want to put a fruit tree in this environment. Well, that's fine. You know, we need to celebrate where we're from. We don't know where we're going until we know where we come from, right? But fruit culture is a little bit different. We're trying to put a tree into an environment like this. We need to provide an adequate, optimal conditions for these trees to survive. And oftentimes that means manipulating the environment, creating berms that we then plant our fruit trees onto to provide adequate drainage, creating swales in between those rows so that we can get equipment through that if we're developing an orchard. We want to keep the orchard floor as clear as possible, and that'll make sense when we talk about maintenance in a moment. And of course, we're training these trees. We need to get around those trees to adequately train them to get as much from those trees as we can. And so we need to provide adequate spacing between plants. This is an image from Texas A&M University's, one of the websites. I found an image from one of our partnering organizations within the university systems of a peach orchard. So this is a good example of what we need to strive for when we're putting fruit trees either in an orchard or even in our backyard. We need to keep that area as clean as possible so those trees can produce as well as they can. Now, you remember me saying that you need to know where you're at. Where you're at dictates how successful you can be, and will let you know what kind of resources you need to add to have that tree produce as well as we anticipate it should. Here in Brazoria County, we know that the average rainfall is about 52 inches per year. Sometimes we get more, sometimes we get less, but we know on average we can get quite a bit of rain. Fortunately, it doesn't all drop at once. We get it spread out over time. We have our seasonal rains like right now during the summer. Our soils, they've been deduced by the USGS and soil surveys to have alluvial loams and clays, which means they're productive soils, but we may need to manipulate our soil environment just a little bit to make sure that the soils are productive for the trees that we put into them. Our range of pH can be anywhere between 5.8 to 8.4. I know that those are extremes, but we sit in the sweet spot where figs like it best. You remember I was saying that fig trees prefer pH, soil pH, anywhere between 6 to 7.5. Well, we just happen to be right in that sweet spot here in Brazoria County. On average, our soil pH is around 6.5. Get to know what USDA plant zone you live in. Some fig trees are a temperate tree, and some are more cold sensitive than others. There are varieties that are more cold tolerant. If you know what your average lowest temperature might be, that will help you decide which trees are best for your landscape or your yard. And of course, chill hours. Now, fig trees, like pomegranate trees, are fairly low on that scale. When we say chill hours, we're talking about a cumulative hours recorded below 45 degrees during our winter. Oftentimes here in Brazoria County, that could be mid-November all the way into when the peach trees start producing flowers, right? So late February. We're recording those hours to determine what certain fruit trees need a certain number of hours of dormancy or chill hours to be able to initiate a process for producing those flowers and then what we hope to be fruiting. Getting to know what that is will help you determine what trees are appropriate for your area. So again, fortunately, figs are fairly low in their chill hour requirement. Brazoria County is rated at 400 chill hours, but folks, I'm telling you, I've been documenting this information over the past several years. We're lucky if we get up to 400 chill hours. That will determine, if you're deciding on putting in peach trees, for instance, it'll determine what variety will work best in our area. We need varieties that are rated below 400 chill hours, but not too low. For figs, again, they're fairly low in chill hours that they require. So we're fairly fortunate here in our county that we can host that we can provide that environment for those trees. Site considerations, whether you've got trees planted in the ground or you're determining whether to put trees in the ground, always get a soil test. A soil test provides a foundation of understanding that would help us to identify the nutrients that are available to those plants that are available in the soil. They give us a range of pH so we understand what pH we have starting with. Also, they provide information about soluble salts in the soil, or salinity. It provides us with a foundation for more efficient maintenance and reduces challenges that we might experience in our environment. Typically, we're putting in trees. The folks that are viewing this today, I anticipate that you live in a city, and maybe you're thinking about incorporating a fig tree into your yard. Oftentimes, urban soils have a variability in the soil profile that to develop a house, the soil profile has been disturbed and mixed. And oftentimes we might get something that we did not have prior to building on that land. So oftentimes, because we're actively involved in our landscape, we're also compacting the soils. So just keep that in mind. Have a soil test committed. Your local county agent can help you interpret the results of that. And where do you get a soil test? Of course, we have a laboratory. Colleagues that are in College Station have a laboratory called the Soil, Water, and Forage Testing Laboratory in College Station. There's the website for it, soiltesting.tamu.edu. You can download forms. Once you get a form, you stipulate what you're trying to look at, what you're working the soil for, whether it's a lawn environment or ornamentals, or possibly in our case, fruit trees. Document that on the form that you're sending in. Doesn't cost much. It's a very minimal fee for a basic test. Send it in. They'll send a report back to you. If you indicate, they'll also send your agent, like myself, a report. Provide that at least initially, and then maybe take a check on that soil again within 2 years or 3 years, just to see what's going on in the soil around those plants. The information on this slide regarding water testing is really more applicable to orchard development, but I think it still applies to home tree. If you're putting one single tree in your yard, you do want to know what your water quality is like, because water quality will impact how your tree functions, the nutrients it can absorb through solution. Also, yes, it's just a good thing to understand the quality of the water that you're working with. Now, fortunately, figs are a lot more forgiving of not poor water quality, but not stellar water quality. But once you get a test performed, you'll understand what you're working with. You also want to make sure that you have enough water quantity to provide to that tree. Remember that figs are shallow rooting with fibrous roots. That means that maybe you want to plant that tree just a little bit deeper than you normally would for an ornamental tree, slightly deeper. Provide it from some protection from its surrounding soil volume. But you also want to try to reduce any evapotranspiration and transpiration coming from that plant in the surrounding area. You can calculate the evapotranspirative rate. There are programs associated with AgriLife Extension colleagues that head up a water quality department to check on that, and I do have a link to that resource at the end of this presentation. So again, make sure that you've got adequate quantity to give to that tree, because even here in Brazoria County in Angleton, we can undergo drought conditions, and I need to make sure that I'm getting water to those plants to have them thrive and survive. I talked about mulch. How do you estimate mulch? This is a really quick overview of a calculation that you can provide. Maybe you want to mulch, but you don't know how much mulch is necessary for that tree or your environment. Really simple, folks. Just take the length times width, figure out the square footage of the area that you're working in, and then multiply that square foot by the depth. And use these factors. These are factors or percentages that have been calculated from inches. So since we need to provide 3 to 4 inches of mulch around a fig tree, figure you've got about that factor for 3 inches depth is about 0.009375. Multiply that by the square footage, and that will dictate how much mulch you would need. If you go to a bulk yard and you talk to someone there, you may not have a clue as to how much to actually ask for. Are you asking for a quarter of a cubic yard? Are you asking for a whole cubic yard, which is quite a bit of material? So again, be as cost efficient as you can. Determine how much you're actually going to need so that you can be a more efficient gardener. You also need to know how well that soil drains, and you can figure that out quite simply by using a percolation test. And a perk test is a really simple method that you can use to see how well your soil is draining. So 3 steps. First off, dig a hole. Just get out your shovel. You probably have a shovel. It looks just like the one in this image in your garage. Get out there, dig a shovel. dig a hole. Use your shovel to dig a hole at least 1 foot wide by 3 foot deep. Think of it this way. Say you don't have a tape measure on you, which you should have a tape measure, but you don't have a tape measure. How deep is 3 feet? Simple. The head of a shovel is approximately 10 inches to a foot long. Use that as your guide of measurement. A 3 foot hole is going to be about 3 of those shovel heads deep. Simple. Step 2, fill the hole with water. Let it sit overnight because you're trying to saturate that soil, that hole first to get a more accurate reading. Then the next day, refill the hole with water to see, and then start checking on how well that water is draining. And to do that, get some more tools from the garage. Maybe you've got an extra 2x4 laying around. Simply lay that across the top of the hole. Or you've got a piece of bamboo that you've salvaged and used from your vegetable production, tomato production. Just lay that across the top as your reference stick. Take a yardstick or a tape measure, put that down to the bottom of the hole, and then measure how much drainage you're getting every couple of hours. Get your children involved, get your grandchildren involved, get the neighbors' children involved. Give them 10 cents or a penny every time they go out and check that hole. Have them report back to you. If you're not getting adequate drainage within about 10 hours, you're not seeing much drainage, you might want to consider picking another spot that you can plant that tree in, or you may consider a raised bed that you can put that fig tree in. All right, folks, 6 steps to success. A little bit of information about culture that you can apply to your small orchard or possibly your backyard planting. Of course, we'll talk about planting and maintenance, practice proper sanitation, pruning and training, control weeds, pests, and pathogens, protecting your fruit, and of course the rock stars, choosing those appropriate cultivars for your area. A little bit about planting and maintenance. We want to give these trees at least a good 16-foot spacing between plants. You have to give them some room, folks. These trees can, if left unattended, they will get quite wide. So give them enough space that you can work around them. Okay? You might want to plant them just slightly deeper, maybe about 2 inches deeper than you normally would an ornamental tree. Typically, when we plant ornamental trees, we plant them flush or maybe just a little bit higher from the soil level that they were growing in their pot. But you want to plant fig trees just slightly deeper. There'll be a little bit of settling going on, but remember, these are shallow rooting plants. Watering, you want to water them regularly, about 1 inch a week during periods of dry or drought. Just use common sense. If you have a wet period, like we just had some pretty torrential rains yesterday and we accumulated about 3 inches, I'm not going to go out to the orchard to water those trees right now. I know I've got enough penetration. I know that intuitively as well as practically. I've gone out and measured that before, and trust me, I'm doing fine. But during dry spells, you want to make sure that you get adequate water to that. And I recommend drip irrigation for fig trees. Fig trees are notorious for attracting or having an infestation of a fungal pathogen called fig rust. If you didn't have it before, you may anticipate you're going to have it in the future. So to lessen the chance of that happening, the best method of watering, of course, is drip irrigation, not overhead watering onto the foliage. We want the foliage to dry out in between rain events. Fertilization, I'd say use a soil test as your guide. Our extension office recommends frequent applications of more of a higher nitrogen product, but we don't really get into the detail of what that is. I think in general, use a fertilizer that has a ratio of 3:1:2. The number 3 represents the percentage of nitrogen in that product. 1 is the percentage of phosphorus in that product, and then 2 is the percentage of potassium, potash in that fertilizer, in that bag of fertilizer. So any fertilizer with a ratio of 3:1:2, I think would be adequate. And you want to make sure to fertilize that tree either in late winter or early spring. I've seen a recommendation for utilizing a 2100 fertilizer at half a cup during its first couple of years of growth. When you're planting a fig tree, newly planted, don't fertilize it immediately when you put it in the ground. And the best time to plant it in the ground, of course, is late winter, right around Valentine's Day, maybe a little bit later. Pay attention to your frost dates to know when to put that plant in the ground. We always want to practice orchard sanitation. Remember, you need to remove, destroy any kind of diseased or infected parts. If you see some affected leaves from this fig rust, of course, you want to pull those off as applicable. It's best to prune trees, fig trees, in early spring, but it depends on the variety. But anyway, you can prune any dead material any time of the year. Remember, a dead branch is a dead branch. So take that out any time of the year. That's all right. But of course, any diseased twigs or branches, you just want to remove those. Unless you're drying figs on the tree purposefully, you want to remove any fruit that's on there that's rotting, because that's just an attractant for varmints, rats, squirrels, anything that really likes fermented vegetables, fermented fruit, or insects, even fungal pathogens that might be attracted to that rotting fruit. So again, remove any fruit that you're not utilizing. And of course, always keep the orchard floor clear and clean to protect those trees. Pruning and training. You remember I told you that these trees can get pretty darn big. And you can see by this image that I borrowed from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension that this one looks like it's at least a good 20 feet tall and fairly wide, maybe a little bit wider than that, multi-trunked. We do want to prune these trees like any other fruit tree to keep it to a size that we can manage. So unlike most other fruit trees, you provide more of a natural shape pruning for this tree. Here's an example of two types of forms that you can give to this bushy type of growth. So remember, fig trees naturally are multi-trunk specimens. If you get a plant and you put it directly in the ground and it's just one little stick that you've put in, from a 1 gallon that you purchased at the nursery, if you put it in spring, go ahead and head that tree back to get it to start putting out lateral branches. But sometimes you will encourage this multi-trunking habit. If that's the case, you can certainly prune it into more of a natural form shrub shape. I prefer to experiment with single trunk specimens. It helps me to mow and maintain underneath that tree a little bit adequately. I think your choice of pruning shape is dependent on your aesthetic and how much work you actually want to provide to that tree in the environment. Fruiting develops on current year growth, and there is an exception to that. There are some varieties that are determined to produce a breva crop. What that means is that's a terminology that's used for a tree that is known to produce a spring fruiting, so twice a year. It might be a smaller size of fruit in the spring, and then you'll get the full size in the fall. But those varieties are identified as a breva crop. We're producing twice a year. From Extension Emeritus George McEachern, our fruit and nut specialist, he suggests not to prune mature Celeste and Alma trees. It will reduce the crop size. So keep that in mind for those two types of trees that will produce a breva crop. I would suggest to wait till you get that breva crop and then prune those trees, right? Kind of head them back. Don't let your trees get too big. And of course, Texas Everbearing will produce a fair crop following a heavy winter pruning, heavy late winter pruning. So keep that in mind. Texas Everbearing and brown turkey are actually the same tree. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. All right. You want to control weeds, pests, and pathogens? This does go with saying you need to keep this in mind, because I've heard this terminology used, and of course it makes me smirk a little bit as a bit of a bad boy, but I don't think of myself as a lazy gardener. I think of myself as an efficient gardener. Yes, we want to be as efficient as possible, and certainly keeping track of these trees helps us to cultivate them efficiently. mulching at about 4 inches, efficiently managing those weeds underneath the trees. You can use products, an herbicide with active ingredient glyphosate, but if you are using a broad or general non-target herbicide like something that contains glyphosate, I suggest not to use it around those freshly planted trees, at least the first year. Just go ahead and hand cultivate those weeds around that tree. We don't want to affect that new tender growth that we're anticipating on that tree. We want it to get established before we start using a product like glyphosate around it. Fig rust, yes, indeed, it's a reality. You may get fig rust on your trees. The best way to avoid that, of course, is proper sanitation. If you see, just know what it looks like. Hit it before it starts affecting all of the foliage. Discard affected leaves. You may have to apply a copper-based fungicide at the onset to try to control it. Fig mosaic virus, that is a potential possibility. There is no control for that particular viral pathogen. The best way to avoid that is by keeping your orchard floor clean, which it doesn't quite eliminate, but it reduces the insects that might deliver that virus to your tree. And always use clean plant stock when you're planting in the ground. And then, of course, we work with a fig form called the common fig or fig type. Those are often closed-eyed figs. We'll discuss that in a moment. So the best way to avoid beetle infestation or insect infestation in through the eye of that fig fruit is by using closed-eyed varieties. Just reduce the instance of that. Remember me saying that you can use fruit protection. There are several different products available on the market. One of them is provided by Clemson University Extension. They're called the Clemson bags. They're thin paper bags with a twist tie embedded in them. You put them around the fruit to protect them. Now with figs, you can get quite a number of figs on a large tree. It depends on if you want to take the time to do that, but I love squirrels and I hate squirrels, and I know that squirrels are problematic with trees like this, as well as birds. So you might want to use methods like this to either protect the individual fruit or the tree itself. You could consider these products called organza gift bags. Organza is a type of synthetic fabric that's often used in gift bags. They're kind of pastel colored, kind of often metallic looking, but they're porous. They allow oxygen to pass through that. So you might consider something like that. The sky's the limit. Use your imagination for protecting the fruit. If you do decide to protect the entire tree, make sure that tree is small enough that you can do this with. If you've got a tree that's 20 foot tall and at least 30 foot wide, it's not going to be practical for you to try to protect that tree. You're going to have to give up some of those fruits to those animals. So just keep those trees, including fig trees, fruit trees, pruned to a size that you can manage. All right, let's talk about the rock stars. Fig varieties for our Gulf Coast. Some of these may also apply to the area that you live in. A little bit about figs. Of course, we promote the Path to Plate program. Our overarching program for AgriLife Extension guides the program areas that we currently have. We know that figs are nutritious. They're a great source of dietary fiber. They're a wonderful source of calcium, and they're fat-free, sodium and cholesterol-free. Plus, they're nature's candy. I just love figs. I think they're outstanding. Now let's talk a little bit about the fruit. Did you know that there's a technical name for the fruiting type? And I'll explore that with you. Technically, it's called the syconium. The syconium is an enlarged, fleshy, hollow receptacle with multiple ovaries inside. Believe it or not, folks, what you're eating is a fruit, but the fruit is actually made of stem tissue that surrounds dozens or hundreds of unpollinated flowers. I think that's pretty cool. So when you eat a fig fruit, you're actually, when you taste something a little, not gritty, but a little bit, with a little bit more texture to it, you are actually eating dozens of little unpollinated flowers inside. There are 4 forms of figs that occur naturally. One is San Pedro, another one is The Smyrna fig, another type is Capra fig, and the ones that we use successfully in the South is called the common fig type. Common fig types often have a completely closed or tight eye, or ostiole, or they have a semi-closed eye. So why is that important to know? Well, the other types of figs, the other three that I mentioned, they actually do require a pollinizer to produce fruit. A tiny little blastophagous wasp that provides a service transferring pollen from one fruit to another. There's a much larger discussion on those types and pollination for those figs that you can investigate later. But I'm just giving you this brief information to understand what we're working with. So again, we can be more successful with closed eye figs or semi-closed eye. The cool thing about common fig types is they are parthenocarpic. That means that they form a fruit without fertilization. Remember, those eyes are closed, so those insects, the insect that would the fig wasp that can normally go through an open-eyed variety, it's not going to get in there. So those flowers are never pollinated. They'll never form a seed. Again, these are forming fleshy stem tissue with no seeds, with a gelatin-like interior with unfertilized flower structure. Now, for those of you who have pulled fresh figs off of the tree, these trees, Ficus corica, is in a plant family called the Moraceae. The Moraceae is a plant family with plants known to produce a kind of a latex or a white sap that some people may have contact dermatitis with, or a little bit of a rash if you get that on your skin. Think of a poinsettia. Poinsettia is not in this family. I'm just using that as an example. Poinsettias, when you peel off a leaf, you see that white kind of latex, milky latex, that's a little toxic. Well, the same thing is happening in fig trees and members of this family. If you pull a fig off of the tree and it's not ripe, oftentimes you'll get this latex sap that starts to weep from the stem, from the fruit stem called the peduncle. You'll see it start weeping from that area. The best way to tell if a fig is ripe, always look for the optimal color that you want out of that, and we'll see some of that in a moment with some of these varieties. But also look and see how that fruit, if the fruit starts to droop just a little bit. You just have to do this over and over again, right? Go out to your fig tree. Wait until the time where you think those fruit are ripe enough for you to choose, and then just start picking one off at a time. Your fig tree is going to produce so many fruit. It's okay if you lose one or two for this experiment. You just have to get used to how this works by redundancy. All right, let's talk varieties. Alma. Alma is a green fig. Wonderful medium size, late season, rich sweet pulp. It is frost sensitive, so for Alma you do need to provide it some protection. The video that we saw a few moments ago, we do have Alma out in our demonstration garden. We also have Celeste. You saw how big that tree could get. Has a tightly closed eye. They're very cold hardy, and they do provide quite a bit of growth to the tree itself. So you do want to make sure that you keep it into a form that you can actually manage. Italian black. I love figs because there's such a variety of texture and color associated with them. One is Italian black. It's great for preserves, fairly large fig. It'll produce about, I'd say about 3 inches in diameter, maybe 4 inches if you're lucky. They can have the capacity to produce a breva crop twice a year. LSU purple. I love the contrast of color. Inside kind of white or yellowish. The outside is this wonderful crimson color, crimson, very deep purple. I just love the variation of this teardrop shaped fruit. It's a little bit milder than Italian black, but there's nothing wrong with that. Your palate is your palate. Some folks really like a stronger tasting fig. Some like a little bit more moderate or sweeter tasting fig. And certainly you can investigate this information to find out which fig is right for you. Brown turkey, also called Texas everbearing. They're a late season fig. They're the classic southern fig that we'll see in backyards. They have a sugary taste, and they do have a breva crop. Some you may consider for maybe appropriate for your area. We have yet to pull this one into our orchard, but we're thinking about incorporating this one. It's called Blue Giant. Produces a very large fruit, about 4 inches in diameter, maybe 5. Large purple skin with pink flesh. It's not as cold tolerant as Celeste, but we're thinking it may actually work well down here in the coast. So I'm going to try to incorporate that into the demonstration garden. Bernabot is another large pink skin variety. I apologize, I don't have a good picture for Bernabot. You'll have to investigate that yourself. But it does have a closed eye and is appropriate for our area. Another one, Lemon, has these wonderful, unique citrus overtones to the fruit itself. Provides a yellow skin, smaller fruit, kind of creamy flesh. I hope that you investigate some of these figs and think about incorporating some of these into your landscape. Let's say you live in a townhouse, which I currently do, and you're strapped for space. You can work with some varieties that are known not to get very big. On your porch, think varieties like Green Ischia, Little Miss Figgy. I've got Little Ruby. It's considered to be a true dwarf specimen. It's not going to get very big, and I haven't had it produced just yet. I'm hoping that later on this year it will actually, well, I'm going to train it, so I'm actually looking forward to next year where it will produce fruit. Petite Negri, I believe that's an Italian version, medium black, dark purple fruit, can get about 10 by 10, or maybe Violetta de Bordeaux. My Texas accent doesn't do justice to the pronunciation of some of these varieties. Anyway, experiment with figs appropriate for container planting. These are just some of the resources that we'll offer to you. Again, this presentation is being recorded. We'll have it available to you at a later date, along with the resources that we're indicating here. Always visit Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, your one-stop shopping for information that's valuable for Texas gardeners. We have information that's specific to our state and our regions in Texas. So Aggie Horticulture Fruit and Nut Resource is a wonderful place to go for appropriate information for your cultivation of fruit and nut trees in Texas. I did borrow a link from one of our fruit and nut specialists out in Fredericksburg. He works primarily with peaches and grapes, and he's got a nice fig collection. Jim Camus out in Fredericksburg. He's the director of a research station out there. He did have a blog, and he talked a little bit about propagating figs. So we've got some information providing to you so that you'll be successful with these as pass-along plants. You remember me talking about evapotranspiration. You can determine what the evaporation and transpiration from your environment is by going to this link to the Texas A&M AgriLife ET network. It will help you determine what resources you will need to make sure that your plants are adequately watered. Of course, the Soil, Water, and Forage Testing Lab to check on your soil and water. Texas Plant Disease Handbook developed by our colleagues over at the Texas Plant Disease and Diagnostic Lab. Great folks that provide wonderful information and diagnostic services for plants that you may have that are ill in. We can send in samples from our office, or we can direct you on how to send in samples of your plants to their offices for further investigation. And we also recognize those extension colleagues from other states, LSU Ag Center, Louisiana Figs. There's quite a number of hybridization, quite a number of new releases of figs from LSU in Louisiana. So we ask you to visit their website. Purdue University Extension, of course, Purdue's been around for a long time as far as extension. They've got a lot of skin in the game, so they've been around for a really long time. They have wonderful information for you as well. And then University of Florida, IFAS Extension. But remember, your first stop shopping should be Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I thank you for joining me here today for this version of Aggie Horticulture Facebook Live. Again, I'm Stephen Brueggerhoff, Horticulture Agent for Brazoria County, serving our community and our state community through programs like this.